So I've known Cedric over the years. I've always been impressed by his work. So many times when I've read his papers, I've read the ideas in there, and I was like, gosh, how come he got to it first? So I'm just following in his footsteps in many of my research directions. So with that, hey, thank you for coming, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Jason, for having me. Thank you for the nice lies you just said, but I've taken them to heart. Right, I mean, it's always a pleasure to be here. I think the last time was probably a good dozen years ago. So, every time I come here, I feel older. That's really great. So today, I'll be talking about work that's mostly really done by one of my graduate students, Olivier, who is about to defend. But there are other bits in our research having to do with Bayesian persuasion that other people in my group are involved as well. And today, I want to talk about Bayesian persuasion, but also, and I'll tell you what that is for those of you who are not aware, and especially how we can go beyond Bayesian persuasion, kind of removing this Bayesian assumption. And in the process of doing that, we'll see kind of different tools that can be brought to bear, one being a weak revelation principle, and another one going all the way back to Blackwell. All right, so as an introduction, there is the sound okay, by the way? Because I'm mute. Okay, yeah, but I'm used to having like a wire, we're still, back in Illinois, we still have wired microphones. So I don't intend, I know there's way too much text on this, and I don't expect you to read all of this, but this is kind of to give you a general picture of the kind of systems that this notion of strategic information transmission that Bayesian persuasion is rooted in applies to. So there's a growing number of situations nowadays where the mechanism for controls, the way in which we approach controlling systems, is through information that is being provided to agents as part of that system. And this goes from, for example, problem of attacks on various systems, right? When we're talking about cyber secure controls, we're thinking specifically of some of the sensors being tampered with. And in that case, so you're getting wrong measurements. And the point is not just that you're getting wrong measurements, but you're getting measurements that are being tampered with for the goal of mismanaging or miscontrolling the system, right? So this is some kind of strategic manipulation of data. Others where, in a smart city type of application or a Waze context, right? I'm sure we're all familiar with Waze by now, right? With this idea of just Google Map, aka Waze, is just telling you which route you should take from point A to point B. And in so doing, it's not just trying to recommend to you a particularly good path, but it's also trying to shape globally how traffic is routed in the interest of everybody. At least that's a possible socially advantageous way in which Waze could function. And I guess the one, another kind of context that we're all very aware of right now, right, is this idea of information being sent to the public, not just to inform them specifically, but to try to get them to, make particular decision about how to, whether to accept the vaccine or not, right, or to make particular decisions. And in all these cases, again, the mechanism through which your decision-making agent is influenced is through the information that they receive. And the important thing that is common to all those scenarios is that this information is crafted, right? It is strategically being sent by an agent with its own goal to get the receiving agent to take particular decision, right? As opposed to just information being displayed for you to actually get accurate measurement or accurate knowledge, right? This is crafted information. And so if we want to understand and design the systems, come on, all right, does this work? Yeah. This requires a model or some understanding of how an agent, in this case, typically the agent being a human being, right, uses this procured information and react to this procured information, right? And there are some models that exist for that. in particular coming from the information economics literature, the most seminal of which being this notion of Bayesian persuasion that I'll get into. But for all its good aspects, Bayesian persuasion is still very much missing a lot of the ingredients that are very germane to the problem of having a human decision maker in a socio-technological context, right? And so a lot of the things that I want to discuss today and that my group has been really involved with in the past 5 years, if not a little more, is trying to take this paradigm of Bayesian persuasion as a starting point and see how we can enrich it to be able to address those situations, those control design situation analysis that I described before. In particular, how do we go around this very central assumption that is in the name of Bayesian persuasion, right? Like the Bayesianity. And when we do that, what does it take technically? What kind of math tools do we need to be able to do that? And how do we need to change things? Okay, so I realize that I haven't even told you what Bayesian persuasion is yet. So it sounds like, okay, great, that's what you're doing. But what is it? Well, I'm glad you asked. So this is the basic model. This is the most vanilla version of Bayesian persuasion. And I think some of you may have seen this picture on some of my slides before. But so what's happening? Again, this is reduced to its simplest form to really capture the gist of this persuasion element. So what's happening? We have two agents, one sender and one receiver. Your sender is going to be Alice, and your receiver for now is Bob. And later on, we'll see some cousins of Bob, just replacing Bob. And Alice has access to a state of the world, omega, that is a random variable that only she can observe. And she needs to send a message, possibly over some noisy channel, but not today, right? There will be no noise today. But Alice observes the state of the world, omega, sends a message to Bob, a message Y, right? And what does Bob do? Based on that message, Bob updates his prior about omega into a posterior, right, using Bayes' rule, right? So you have a prior, you get a message or an observation, and so you can modify your prior into a posterior, right? And then based on that posterior, Bob is going to choose an action that maximizes his conditional expectation, condition on the message that he received. Everybody with me? Right? So this is how Bob acts upon receiving something from Alice. And Alice, knowing this, has to decide which message to send to Bob so that this action is not just good for Bob, but it's good for her, according to her own utility V. Right? So you see this element of persuasion, right? Here, you could imagine putting a cost even on information transmission, but that's not even part of the most vanilla model, right? It's really, I send you an action, right? I need to make your recommendation or to say something about the state of the world to drive your best response to be good for me.
And so should we be assuming throughout that Bob knows Alice's mechanism for generating messages?
So it is a Stackelberg version. So Alice commits to a mechanism. Yes. So Bob responds, right? Alice chooses that mechanism, and given that mechanism, Bob responds to it. That's correct. Go ahead.
And Bob is always doing maximum likelihood estimation, and Alice knows that.
So for now, okay. Yes, because the agent who will not do that will not be called Bob later. But for now, so when I say Bob, right, that's what Bob does. Bob applies Bayes' rule and does exactly maximum, and then optimizes his utility, then maximizes his expected utility condition on the message. Okay? All right. Model clear? So this is, again, so the question is, what does Bob play? And how should Alice message Bob so that this is to her benefit? Come on. All right. So this kind of explains more mathematically and more precisely what happens, but this is exactly what I told you here. And the important thing is this is a Stackelberg game where Alice is the leader. And again, Bob plays in a response to an announced mechanism that Alice commits to, okay? And rather than one of those complicated model that I started with as motivation, let me show you probably what is a very, very simple situation to kind of make sure we're all on board here. And that's actually the example that is part of the seminal work of Gentzkow and Kamenica that introduces this notion. So very, very simple framework here, where the state of the world is just 0, 1, right? So it could be, you know, whether it's good or whether it's bad today, right? So this is omega. Similarly, your action set is also 0, 1. So these are the actions that Bob can take. And what is Bob trying to do? Bob is trying to properly estimate the state of the world, right? So he gets 1 if he gets the state of the world right, and he gets 0 otherwise, okay? So Bob is trying to estimate the reality of the fact. While Alice is interested, Alice, you could say, in this example, I would say could be a propagandist, right? Who's trying to get Bob to, she's getting a reward if Bob takes action 1. But in the example of Kamenica and Gentzkow, it's more of a prosecutor example where the receiver is a judge, right? Bob is a judge and Alice is a prosecutor, and Alice is interested in getting people found guilty, right? And so she is rewarded by a guilty verdict, and 0 is not guilty, 1 is guilty in reality, right? So Bob is interested, the judge in this example is interested in correctly identifying whether a client is guilty or not. Alice is interested in getting the client convicted, right? Now, so this is the framework, right? So if you go through the steps, what's happening? So mu here, so this is the important thing. Mu is the belief that gets created at Bob upon receiving a message, right? I'm not telling you how that belief has been created, but that's the posterior belief of Bob induced by a message. Everybody with me? So obviously, go ahead.
Cedric, what's the message here? Message can be binary or?
The message could be anything, but that's exactly the right question. Thank you for the plant, right? Is that you're interested in trying to find out what the messaging policy is, but it may be very rewarding, and that's going to be an ongoing theme throughout the talk, to not think of that as your main variable in the problem. And here, it's actually going to be more rewarding to think first in terms of the posterior belief induced at Bob, regardless of how that happens. So I could be using all kind of mechanism, right? I could have a very, very rich message space of dimension 25, or maybe I don't need to, right? Or I could make very simple recommendation, right? Alice could just say, he's guilty, he's not guilty, right? But putting that aside for a minute, let's just think of the posterior belief induced at Bob. So if you're Bob, and this is your posterior belief, so what do you do? Well, if your posterior belief, and here it's entirely captured by the mean of that posterior belief, right? So the belief is just one number in that case, right? If the a posteriori probability that omega is larger than 1 is larger than 1/2, you're going to believe, you're going to take the action 1, because that's what rewards you, right? If after receiving the message, you believe that it's more likely that the state of the world is 1, you're going to pick 1, because you want to be correct. And if it's less than 1/2, you're going to pick 0, because you want to be correct. Does that make sense? Right? So if you're Bob, very simple, you do your Bayes rule or whatever, right? You look at your belief. If it's more likely that it's guilty, you say guilty. If it's more likely that he's innocent, you say innocent, right? Now, what does that induce for Alice? Again, Alice gets a reward only if Bob believes guilty. So this is the utility of Alice. This is the blue curve, right? This is what Alice is trying to get, right? Or this is what Alice is getting for that particular, as a function of the belief mu that she induced at Bob. She gets 0 all the way to 1/2 excluded, right? And if she can get Bob to believe that he's guilty, that the client is guilty with probability larger than 1/2, she gets 1. Everybody with me? Okay, so that's, right? Again, that doesn't quite tell me how to message, right? But that tells me what the Alice utility is in terms of the posterior ability. Now, given that, how would I be able to find that strategy? Well, there's two kind of tools that you can get, and I want to talk about them first, because as we move to a Bob that's not Bayesian, I will need to see how those tools are modified. Come on. Okay, so the important thing here is that you can actually turn Alice's program. Again, nominally, Alice is interested in finding the mechanism pi, what to message. But if you think entirely in terms of posterior beliefs, you can rewrite Alice's program into what's in that purple box here. That is, what Alice is trying to do, if she doesn't focus on the pi mechanism, but rather on the belief she's inducing and the probability with which those beliefs are induced, is she wants to maximize this expectation subject to this constraint. This constraint, what does this constraint mean? Again, so for every message M, you induce a posterior belief, mu M. Right? Every message that Bob receives generates a belief. Those beliefs are distributed with some probability distribution, tau M. It's a distribution over distribution. Right? The important thing is that whenever Bob is Bayesian, those beliefs are not arbitrary. Rather, the mean of those beliefs, of those induced beliefs, is equal to the prior. And that's if and only if. This is what this lemma says. So that in itself is actually, it's a well-known lemma, but it's very powerful. That means if you're Bayesian, the posterior beliefs that you're creating are not arbitrary. They're related to the prior in exactly this form. Right? So sometimes in economics, people call that a splitting of the prior, because you're given a belief and you have to split your beliefs into posteriors such that when you take their convex combination, according to their probability, you're still reconstructing the prior. Okay. So this is why thinking in terms of induced belief is actually valuable, because you can rewrite Alice's program entirely in terms of those beliefs. So what does that mean? Again, going back to our example. Come on. Okay. So the blue curve here was, again, Alice's utility, right? Now, what do I do to solve this problem? As I say, well, my prior is nu here, right? And I need to see how I can write nu as a convex combination of induced posterior beliefs so as to maximize the convex combination of the values of Alice, right? So I need to decompose this nu. I need to write nu as a convex combination of beliefs between 0 and 1 so as to get the maximum combination for nu of possible values. If you think a little bit about it, but hopefully that shouldn't take too much thinking, this is what you would do. Right? For example, if you decompose nu, you can decompose nu, of course, as a combination of anything, right? As long as you take one belief to this side and one belief to that side, you can rewrite nu as a convex combination of that, right? For example, if you were to say nu is a convex combination of 0 and 1/2, you could do that, and then what value would you get? You would get, well, you know, the coefficient times the value of 0 times the coefficient at the value at 1/2, you would get 0. So that's obviously not very high. Or you could decompose, well, actually on this curve, you would get 1/2 up there. So not 1/2, but all the way to 1/2, then you would get 0. However, if you take exactly 1/2, you don't get 0, you get the 1 over there, right? And so the value you get out of that is this dot. And that's actually the... Well, that means that Alice needs to generate two beliefs. She's going to generate a belief at 0, a posterior belief at 0, and she needs to generate a posterior belief at 1/2. So yes, there will be randomization to get to that 1/2, right? But essentially what that tells you is this red curve, the concavification of Alice's blue curve, is what she will get, right? The maximum value she can expect through signaling is the concavification of this blue curve in terms of belief. So that's one kind of tool that's available, is this concavification procedure, where you say, you think of your prior, right? And you say, how can I split my prior into posterior beliefs so that using the same coefficient that show up in the convex combination, I maximize the utility that Alice gets. Okay? So that's conceptually nice, but in practice, that's only very useful only in a situation I can draw like this, right? How do I ever compute a concavification if my distribution is more than one, if my belief is more than one-dimensional? I can't really. The one thing that this is useful for in full generality is to tell me that I don't need more messages than the dimension of the of omega. That's really what that tells me structurally. But this concavification procedure is something that exists and is useful, at least in that sense. Is everybody with me there? Go ahead.
Okay, just an illustration, kind of following up on what Joao said. So, you know, here Alice is going to observe a 0 or 1. Alice obviously knows the prior, and then conveys a signal. I could choose to convey a 0 or 1 with.
So she need.
But what I'm doing is I'm doing something.
So she needs to induce a belief at 0 and a belief at 1/2. So the belief at 0 is basically saying, when it is 0, I'm going to say 0 for sure. So you know it's 0. And the 1 and 1/2 is just, I'm going to use a message that's constant so that you can't tell. Right? I'm just going to tell you the same thing no matter what, so you're not informed by my message. Essentially, that's right. But I get to the signaling policy backwards through the beliefs that I'm inducing at Bob.
And then since Bob knows my signaling strategy, that all then factors through.
Exactly.
The back out.
Exactly. So that's one approach, right? And the change of variable that occurred there, in a way, is that you're not solving the problem by looking for the pi, for the mechanism. You're looking at the problem by looking at the posteriors. Okay. But again, this is very pretty. I mean, that was an AER paper, right? But for Kamenica and Gentzkow, but you can't really do more than draw pictures of this kind with it. Now, more generally, right, beyond that, what can you do? Well, what you could do is you could think, okay, this is just very complicated. Let me simply consider very, very simple strategies for Alice that are recommendations, right? Alice is not going to use some kind of complicated signal with some probability or anything. She's just going to say, okay, you have a number of actions you can take, Bob, and for every value of omega, I'm going to directly recommend an action for you. There is no decoding for you to do, right? I'm going to say either, again, the reality is he's guilty or innocent, and I'm going to tell you should acquit or you should convict, right? I should recommend that. So you can do recommendations, and in that case, it's actually very easy to find the best utility that Alice can get from recommendations. Provided Bob really follows your recommendation, right? If I say you should acquit, but I have no way of making sure that you will acquit just because I told you should, that's useless. But if I tell you should acquit and make sure that it is in your best interest to acquit, you will. And then I know exactly what you're going to do because I recommended it to you. And because I know what you're going to do, I know what I'm getting. So this is this green condition here. This green condition here is, if you want to be fancy, that's your incentive compatibility condition. This guarantees that if I recommend R, if I, Alice, recommend R to Bob, this is actually the decision that Bob is going to make. I'm recommending R, my recommendation, and this says the conditional expectation of taking R is larger than for any other action, so Bob will really take R. And because Bob really takes R, I know as Alice that this is my expected cost, right? And so I'm just maximizing that, right? And that tells me the best I could expect, the best I, Alice, could expect to get by using recommendations. Okay? And this is nice because this is a linear program in this variable x, which is the joint probability of recommending action R given that you're in state omega. So this is something that could scale nicely because it's an LP, right? Of course, it doesn't have the nice drawing that comes with it that the concavification procedure does, but it's something that you could use in full generality, right? And you could say, well, that's great, but that's just the best recommendation of Alice, right? That's the best she can hope by just saying, you should take this action or you should take that action. But is that really the absolute best she can get in general? She has access to other type of signal, right? For example, she could decide to say nothing at all. That's a strategy too. That's another very simple strategy. That's even simpler than recommending, right? So I'm observing something, I'm not telling you anything, right? Or I could just tell you the full state. The thing that is kind of really interesting here is that this is, in fact, without loss of optimality. That in this framework, that the framework we've discussed up to now, the best recommendation Alice can use actually gives her the best utility she can expect to have in general. She doesn't gain anything by going outside of the world, outside of the realm of recommendation. And why is that? That's because of this, well, that's what is explained here, but that's typically called the recommendation principle. Why is that? Well, if I am not using a recommendation, the signal that I send to you does induce an action, right? And so instead of focusing on the message that I sent to you, I should just look at what action this elicits at Bob and just recommend that directly. And the fact that it went through a process of, interpreting the message and deciding on the action becomes irrelevant. All that matters, right, is, in other words, if you wanted to start from the LP and just do a change of variable there to turn it into a different program, you could say, give me a policy that's not a recommendation. Can you construct a recommendation one that gives me the exact same outcome? Yes. Just recommend the action that Bob ended up taking, given that action, given that message, and it will give me the same utility, right? And it's the same because, again, you made sure that when you're recommending, you're only recommending actions that Bob is truly taking. Again, that wouldn't work if you could recommend just anything, right? But that should be, again, the fact that recommendation is an upper bound to the best, well, I'm maxing it, so it's a lower bound on what Alice should expect. That's obvious, because it's a subclass. And the reason why it's an upper bound as well is because given any policy that is not a recommendation, you can transform it into a recommendation by making sure that you recommend the action that he's truly taking. Very obvious, right? Said like that. Okay. So these are kind of the tools that exist in Bayesian persuasion. This is vanilla Bayesian persuasion for normal agents. Now, here's the catch, though. So we have concavification and recommendation. Okay? This really assumed that Bob was Bayesian. Right? This Bayesian lemma, this Bayesian plausibility lemma, is really because it's Bayes' rule. Right? So Bob is Bayesian, and Bob takes exact best response. Right? He really minimizes his expectation. He really computes the expectation correctly, and he really minimizes this conditional expectation. That's a lot to ask of a human. Right? I mean, there are many ways in which Bob would not be Bayesian. And the minute you start opening this kind of worm of, is Bob Bayesian? Then you get into, well, what do you mean by Bayesian? Bayesian, there's only one way to be Bayesian, sorry. But there are many ways to be non-Bayesian. So for those of you, I like that quote a lot. right? That's from that's like the opening line of Anna Karenina, right? Is all happy families are the same, right? But all unhappy families are unhappy in their own ways. There's only one way to be Bayesian, right? There are many, many, many different ways of being non-Bayesian and non-optimal responder, right? And of course, if you want to start getting into all the mechanisms that would get Bob to not be Bayesian, you can imagine looking at this variant or that version or this variant of, I cannot say this variant or that variant of Bob being non-Bayesian. And of course, economists have done that, right? Because they started with these models 10 years ago. So of course, there's a host of models that says, well, what if Bob deforms beliefs in this way or that way or respond in this way? What we want to do here, and that's kind of inspired more by an engineering or control person view of things, is say, I don't want a model for how you deform. Can I be robust? Can I do a worst case kind of view of if Bob is not Bayesian, can I say he's right? I don't want to get into the exact process in which he's not Bayesian. I would just want to do a worst case analysis of how he would deviate from Bayesianity, if that makes sense. I think that's very natural to people who come from control. And so that's what we want to do here, is can we transform those tools? Can we see what Alice needs to do? Not when I have, for a Bob that would be a motivated reasoner or has confirmation bias, but just saying, well, you're not Bayesian. Your belief is not the correct Bayesian posterior. It's in a ball around it. And it's not responding exactly, but it's in a ball around best response. Okay? And so this is where, from Bob, the perfect agent, we move to Bert, right? Who has an epsilon in his name, to see that there is an epsilon involved in the deviation from absolute Bayesianity, right? So he's Bob's cousin. And what does Bert do? Well, so upon receiving a message, Bob was just doing Bayes' rule, right? Updating his prior into a posterior and then best responding. That was Bob. Bert is a little more haphazard, right? He doesn't quite compute the correct posterior, right? He deforms away from the Bayesian posterior, so he ends up with a mu prime. And then he doesn't exactly best respond to mu prime. He's somewhat suboptimal, right? He's going to be epsilon away in his response. So there's two elements in there. And if Alice knows that she's facing a Bert rather than a Bob, right, she's going to account for that. And so she's going to take a worst case kind of approach and say, well, I don't know exactly what that Bert is doing, and I don't want to know. Right? I could maybe be more precise if I go and interview Bert and try to know exactly how Bert reacts to information, etc. But I don't want to. I'm just going to do a worst case over the response of Bert in terms of his erroneous posterior and erroneous best response to that erroneous posterior.
So why not, is there some reason why you're looking at these two senses of errors rather than just thinking about where epsilon away from the true posterior? So we do a worst case analysis over there where their agents are doing the optimal response, but we just don't know what posterior they're responding to. So here you have...
We could do both. So here this is kind of slightly more general. In fact...
I'm asking the question is, does this second level bring any extra actual generality to it?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Actually, a lot of what I'm going to say in the next slides is a Bert that still somehow gets the correct posterior but doesn't optimally best respond. And something interesting happens already.
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So again, great plant. Okay. Is Bert clear? All right. So the first question could be, well, okay, fine. So Bob went away. He's replaced by Bert. Does Alice really need to do anything? Right? I mean, it could be, do I really need to care about the fact that Bert is not Bob and Bert makes mistakes? Like, couldn't Alice just solve the problem for Bob, right? And just turn her back and Bert replaces Bob. She uses the same strategy and it doesn't matter. Well, let's go back to our simplest favorite example here, right? So the difference between Bob and Bert in the prosecutor example is that, again, Bob changes his choice exactly when he gets a posterior belief at 1/2, right? If it's more likely upon receiving message that the person is innocent, I'm going to say he's innocent. It's more likely that he's not, that he's guilty, I'm going to say guilty. Make sense? Bert functions in the same way. The problem is that he doesn't switch exactly at 1/2, right? Even if he gets let's assume that he gets the proper posterior, right? But he's only epsilon away in taking his best decision. In this case, there is a zone of uncertainty there, where he could go either way, right? Between 1 minus epsilon over 2 and 1 plus epsilon over 2, where he could pick either, right? So here he could pick either, right? And the utility of Alice is well defined because she does a worst case. However, in terms of strategy, there's a big difference. If you use the concavification method, which you can still do because it's just applying it to the inf function, but everything is the same, right? You get something like this, but now the belief that Alice needs to induce for Bert is at 1 plus epsilon over 2 here, as opposed to 1/2. And that means that if she's inducing the exactly 1/2 belief at Bert, right? For Bob, she wanted to induce 1/2. If she uses the 1/2 on Bert, she's going to get a convex combination of this plus this. She's going to get 0, right? So all the work, everything she was gaining by inducing complete cluelessness, if you will, at Bob, at 1/2, is lost if you do it on Bert, right? So you have to change your strategy. You cannot use and it's any value of epsilon. It doesn't matter, right? Epsilon could be arbitrarily small. If you're using the 1/2 posterior belief, you're getting 0. So you really have to change your strategy if you're Alice. This is not working. Does that make sense? Right? Incidentally, this shows, yes, you can still use the concavification procedure used in the same way you could use it before, which is you can draw a cute picture for here. Right? But in terms of getting a program like the LP for recommendation, what's happening? We don't know. That's the next question. Is everybody still with me? Wonderful. Okay. So this tells us, yes, Alice has to really care about the fact that it's Bert and not Bob. Okay. So she could still use recommendation, of course, right? The idea of using recommendation doesn't disappear just because your agent is suboptimal. Again, what's the idea of recommendation is I don't just use any message, I recommend specific actions to you. And if the action that I recommend to you is something that I know you will take, for sure, you will take it, right? And so I know what I get from that action, and I can maximize what I get for this recommendation. The difference now is that the incentive compatibility condition is different for Bert than for Bob, right? Because Bert, again, even if he has a correct posterior, even if it's just epsilon away in his response, this is what's happening here. This is a Bert that has correct posterior, but just is epsilon suboptimal, right? Could take any, what is this condition saying? It's saying, I need to be sure, Alice, need to be sure that Bert is going to use my recommendation. He cannot possibly use something else, because if he does, I don't know what I get. And so my recommendation is useless. Or I don't know what I'm getting. So this is to guarantee that my recommendation is more than epsilon away from what Bert would get otherwise. And this is to guarantee that I know that Bert is going to use this R. Right? So this is, again, the best reward Alice could expect to get using recommendations, where the incentive compatibility condition has been replaced. What's interesting here, however, is that unlike the previous case, where there was no loss of, there was the revelation principle against Bob that told us there is no loss of optimality in using recommendation. That is not true here. That is not true anymore. And in fact, it's very easy to see. It's so easy, I dare to show it to you right now. If you make this epsilon too large, if you make this epsilon larger than the maximum of the difference between the reward for Bob's, between two, like the diameter of that reward set, if you will. This isn't feasible, right? If you pick a large, if your Bert is really so clumsy that he really can't tell what's really good for him and everything is ambiguous, there is nothing Alice can recommend to him that guarantees a particular action will be taken, right? But of course, Alice can guarantee some cost, right? She can again say, I'm not going to tell you anything, or I'm going to tell you everything. So in this case, there is a gap between what you can expect to get using recommendations and the absolute best policy that Alice would get. So the full revelation principle breaks down just because your BERT is suboptimal, even if he has correct posterior. Okay? And again, another way to think, that's for large enough epsilon, but even for small epsilon, or even for mid-value epsilon, this could happen. And it's pernicious because you could be in a regime. There are examples. Olivier has beautiful curves of this. If you want to look at the paper later, and nicely crafted example that really illustrate that very precisely. You could have cases where the recommendation program is feasible. It has an optimum. And it's not the optimum you would get for the full problem. And nothing in the program itself tells you recommendations are breaking down. It's just, there's really just a gap between what you can expect to get with recommendation and the absolute best policy that does use the fact, that does exploit the ambiguity that BERT is injecting in. However, and that's kind of one of Olivier's very nice theoretical result there, you can show that for epsilon small enough, and exactly how small is small enough is another question, for a generic type of problem, right, recommendations are still optimal. That is, if you take a Bayesian persuasion game at random, there will be a value of epsilon small enough such that if BERT doesn't err more than epsilon, recommendations are still optimal. And this is genericity in the proper mathematical sense of it. That is, there exists an open and dense subset of games on which this is true. This is proving this. This is where all the work, all the math muscle get. It's a proper generic, like Bayer category type of thing. Okay? So in full generality, recommendations are out of the window. They don't work, right? And there's nothing that tells you that they stop working. However, if your BERT is not too clumsy, they're still good. And the program, that LP, still gives you the solution. The question is, it's impossible to tell just by looking when you're crossing the epsilon at which this is valid or not. But this is still a tool in your toolbox. And so this is what we call a weak revelation principle. It's not true in full generality, but for, again, a small enough BERT, this is still good. Okay? So now, I think I can kind of give you a gist of the Blackwell thing in the remaining 5 minutes. Okay. Any question about this before I do that? Would have to be a short question. All right. So again, there's still this regime where we don't know, right? For the intermediate epsilon, we still don't have any tool to really look at what Alice does. We know she has to take into account the fact that BERT is not Bob. Otherwise, she risks losing everything, right? But I don't have a good program. I don't have an LP. I don't have anything. In principle, I can concavificate, but that's not going to give me that much. Okay, so what would I do? Well, I need to change. If I stay in the same realm as what I've been describing so far, I can't really make progress. So I want to switch gears just a tiny bit and change just the setting a bit. It's the same problem, but what changes now is instead of having a discrete set of omegas, right, like 0, 1, my omega is going to be in R. So it's, or rather than guilty or not guilty, you could say, you know, how bad is the weather going to be, right? Or how much, right? Alice is messaging about the weather, right? So something that's not just a Boolean. And the action is, do you take an umbrella or not, right? Sorry, actually, no, that's not the action. So the state of the world now, and I'm changing my notation a bit because everything is continuous, but X plays the role of omega, but it's in R. And what is Bob doing? Bob is estimating X based on Y. Okay, it's taking its best response. And the cost of Alice, or the reward of Alice, is quadratic in the action and the real state of the world. So that's what Bob does. Bob really takes the best estimate, given the message. And what does Bert do? Bert, again, being Bert, cannot really get X hat of Y. He's responding with some element in an epsilon ball around that guy, right? Because Bert. Right? And when Alice faces Bert, what does she do? Well, she has to account for the fact that Bert doesn't exactly know what he's doing, and so she's taking a worst case over that ball in her response. Right? In that case, and it's 1D. That's very important. It's still 1D. It's in R. X is in R. Okay? In that case, it turns out you can actually solve the program for Bob. And the strategy of Alice is very simple. It basically is say everything or say nothing, depending on the Q and L. Depending on, essentially, if her, in some senses, I can write exactly what the condition is, but there's a condition that, right? If her utility is aligned with Bob's utility, she will want to say everything. So just reveal X so that there's no uncertainty for Bob. And if their utilities are misaligned or disaligned, she will say nothing because she doesn't want him to get it right. Make sense? That's how she would message to Bob, right? Again, you can prove it, right? It's not just make sense, it's improve. Now, if you wanted to write the program for Bert, the difficulty, just to point it out, is, you have an expectation of a worst case. Right? That's not that easy to compute in general, right? First you have to make sure you know what the mean is. You're probably going to get something discontinuous, and then you need to take an expectation there. But in the 1D case, you can actually go about it and end up with something, after you massage everything properly, that has this form for Bert. So it ends up being a minimum of an expectation with respect to rho. So rho is the distribution of X hat that you induce at the receiver, at Bert, of something, again, that's been massaged properly enough that it looks like this. So I change variables here. The important thing is that alpha has something to do with epsilon. Alpha is proportional to epsilon, right? Subject to this condition here. And this is exactly Blackwell's ordering. This essentially just says, that's my fancy way of writing, that rho, the distribution at Bob or at Bert or at the receiver, is induced from the prior through the kind of mechanism that we're talking about. Okay? That Alice, for every value of the state of the world, Alice generates a signal, and then Bob does Bayes, and then updates the prior into a posterior. Right? This is just a fancy way of writing this. But what's nice is that when you do that, when you use this notation, this order is exactly the order that was introduced by Blackwell in the 70s on probability distribution. Right? The idea, what Blackwell was asking is, when can I say that a probability distribution is more informative than another? Right? That you could, when I give you some information, when can I say that one provides more information than the other, and more information in what sense? That is that if somebody were trying to optimize some expected utility based on the information from one source, he would always do better than with the other source. If that's true, I would say that the source that gives me more is more informative. If that's true for all possible utilities. And that turns out to be exactly the order that shows up here. Okay? Fine. What's important here, and I just want to leave you with that, is that there's a way to think about this ordering in terms of a weirdly constructed G function. So you can turn your problem about whether this source is more informative, this source here is more informative than that one, into a problem that involves some G function defined in terms of the distribution, and the constraint will be that this G function has to be framed by two other G functions that are defined in there. Okay. I was hoping I would have a little more, but I don't want to go too much more over there. So using this G function, and it takes a little bit of work because technically the G function that Blackwell introduces is only for compactly supported priors. And here we're not compactly supported because we don't are. So it took a little bit of work on Olivier's part. We can turn Alice's problem, which is all about the problem about the posterior that's induced, into a problem that uses about entirely the G function. That's the idea. And when you do that, you can go through some nice construction, which again would take me, it's not that hard, but if I want to do it usefully, I would need another 5 minutes, which I don't think we should have. But the idea is you turn the problem into a G problem. And at the end of the day, this is what you get. This is what's interesting. You can completely characterize Alice's best policy against BERT using this Blackwell G function approach in the one-dimensional case. If X is in RD, we don't know. We can bound it, but we don't. And what is it? It's maybe not what you would expect. I mean, in hindsight, it's not shocking. But what is it? There is some interval where Alice essentially, I was about to say says nothing. Well, she says something, but it releases no information, right? For all X in that interval, Alice just signals T0, which is not quite the center of that interval, but you can kind of find where it is. And outside of that interval, Alice reveals everything. So it's full revelation outside of that interval, right? If X is very large or X is very small, Alice is going to just go and say, this is X, exactly. And there is an interval in the middle where she says nothing useful. And it's kind of, I don't know, that's not what we expected originally, right? I would have expected maybe some combination of revelation and no revelation, but not like that. Not in this kind of, or some quantization or something, but not this region in the middle, right? Or some gradual deformation everywhere. But that's how she should message BERT optimally. And what's interesting is, so she does give less information to BERT than to Bob, because there's this whole, to Bob again, she would say everything or nothing, and she never does that. Here there's a little bit of both, right? And so BERT gets less information than Bob, and because it's less information in the sense of Blackwell, that also means that BERT gets less utility out of that information than Bob, which is not always a given, right? It's not necessarily because you get less information that it's less useful to you. But in this case, it's true, okay? And so to conclude, that's just my last slide here. I know that's the risk of, trying to show a lot of math at one time, right? If the take-home message there, and if you're interested, please email me and I can point you to exact references. But again, the high-level recap of what I presented today is that when you want to, the basic vanilla seminal work that exists about persuasion, about trying to understand how information influences people's decision, is nominally formulated for Bayesian agents, right? And not only is it a model, the fact that you have a Bayesianity assumption really constrains the type of tools you can use. The minute you want to start considering non-Bayesian agent or suboptimal agents, you have to modify those tools, and the modification is not trivial. But and in particular, the revelation principle, which people often state off the cuff. Like it's this obvious fact that obviously you could just replace my recommendation. Well, you need to, it breaks open and you have to reconstruct it properly for Bert rather than Bob. And in general, it's not always clear whether being less Bayesian hurts Bert. But in the last example I showed you, it's true. Now, so that's kind of the high-level recap of what I presented here. And we have a lot of works that are hot off the press in that direction. We have another weak revelation principle, another reconstruction of the weak revelation principle when it's neither Bob nor Bert. I guess we'll call him Bart because he's on average suboptimal. And in that case, actually, a revelation principle is useful. And in particular, Bart is the kind of agent you would have if he was playing some kind of no-regret strategy, right? So he's playing that game repeatedly, and on average, he's epsilon away, but not at every shot, okay? And in that case, he can do something. And another thing that we're very excited about that Olivier just sent out for CPHS, so actually that one is not just off the press, but has been sent, is connecting all the way back to some of those motivating examples, right? This was all, well, I have a single agent who's not exactly Bayesian, right? How can I do persuasion in that case? If I want to do anything like traffic, right, or any kind of society scale problem, I have those two elements to consider at the same time, right? A single agent is not Bayesian, but now I have a population of them. And how does that, what kind of, how do the complications marry with each other? And so we have a paper that kind of, I think for the first time in the literature, considers those two aspects together. Non-Bayesian populations and what can, a sender like Alice expect to do in this case. All right, and sorry for going a little bit over. That's all the computer's fault. And thank you for your attention.